This is the beginning of a series, and we have a conversation with Mabruk Derbésh, who is a Libyan citizen and a professor of public administration in Tripoli in Libya. I assume this is still a position you have formally.
Yes.
And you were teaching there from 2005 to 2015. You hold a PhD in public administration from Walden University in Minnesota, an MBA, so in Master in Business Administration from the City University in Seattle, Washington State. And you've published, and you're currently working on academic freedom as a subject, and that is also your subject of research while you are a fellow at InIIS at the University of Bremen. We will have another talk on this research subject, but today we want to talk about Libya. And you have taught at Bremen, but also internationally, on academic freedom, but also on politics and history of the Middle East. So thank you for joining us and for declaring yourself ready to do this conversation. We start perhaps with a
Thank you.
welcome, Mabruk, with the description of the current situation in Libya. So now, mid of October 2021, what would you highlight, or how would you describe the current state of affairs?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I like this opportunity, and I like talking about Libya, so this would be an easy topic for me. The current situation in Libya today is a lot of people describe it as laughable. We have, it's hard to really describe what's going on today without really going back a bit, at least. If we go back 60, 70 years, it's a bit much, but let's just go back to the government of Gaddafi before ruled Libya for about 40 years. And it's a government that it's a dictatorship, but it's a soft dictatorship. It's socialist. It didn't have really much of a socialism that didn't really have much of an impact on the society in a way that it was rejected. And I think one of those things where you import different values from outside, even noble values, and they have no connection with the local culture. They seem to get rejected. It's almost like eating a good food that your body is not used to it. So it's one of those things that happen in Libya, and as a result, the government did not know what to do, how to deal with these values or their ambitious programs in Libya, and also the people did not know how to accept them. And as a result, this is a really bad recipe. And as a result, you'll have a form that it form itself in a dictatorship that people feel that it's been imposed on them. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that as well, the rejection format comes out in a form of literature, or people going on the streets, people not being able to absorb these all these the programs, even if these programs are good for them. So what happened after that, and after the 40 years of all of this, the result came out as a complete rejection in 2011, and people revolted in the street, but although revolted really because they wanted to have a better life. And there is a lot of reasons why people wanted to have a better life. It also has to do with the way Libyans perceived themselves, and it was a fallacy basically, because they thought they could live better. And I think the government had failed in many, many ways of really marketing itself in, like what I said, importing values that are not part of the culture, not even close to it. Socialism that does not really have nothing to do with Arabic society. That's why it failed. But also the way it was, the rhetoric was not really anywhere near what's happening on the ground. So this combination, it's like I mentioned, it's a bad recipe, and it's a recipe for disaster. And as a result, people came out requesting or asking for to change their lives, to better their lives, even though they didn't know that they had a good life, actually. But it's, in the forms of all states and all organizations that have socialism sent to it, they tend to omit all the individualism and all the drive to see the values of life and modernity, especially with today's environment in the media, where everything is marketed as in a way that it shows capitalism in the best view. So all that happened in 2011, but the world took this opportunity because the regime in Libya, or the government in Libya, of course, was not elected government, but also was not really hated that much, but stayed too long. And if you stay too long, you overstay your acceptance, or people do not tend to want to change their governments every now and then, even if it's a good government. So with the rejection of all this in 2011, and with the Arab Spring happening in some countries around Libya, many opportunist Western nations came and decided that the government, there need to be a change of regime in Libya, and after that, of course, the regime, it took about a year for the regime to change. It was a bloody undertake by NATO. Libya was bombed for about 8 months, and we know what happened at the debacle of the government and debacle of Libya. At the end of it was the assassination of the leader, the Libyan leader Mabruk Derbésh, and after that, the Libyan state, whatever it was, even though it was known that too many people that didn't have many institutions, either civic or democratic institutions, but had some sort of a state, form of a state. All these states have become a failed, and all these institutions have become a failed institutions, and as a result, it became a failed state. A few years after that, after many attempts to have elections, there was an election in 2012, also was not done properly. The segments of the change in government in 2011, the powerful segment was the religious ones, the Islamic Brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood, and others. Some of them are Al-Qaeda, some of them are ISIS. It was amalgamation of all these groups that had a problem with the way socialism was established in Libya. And if you know the history, I mean, you're familiar with the history of how religious groups dealt with socialism in that part of the world. It's always considered to be an enemy, regardless of what, even though the Libyan society was always a Muslim conservative society, and Gaddafi actually encouraged that and built so many mosques around the world, created an institution in Libya that was in charge of spreading Islam around the world. So all these things were were put in the back seat of many, because the inception of, or the idea behind Gaddafi was completely foreign to them as religious institutions. Of course, Gaddafi did not give any authority to those religious entities, and that's also one of those problems. So all these people came together, and also in 2012, they inserted themselves in the election system, and they became officials. And we're still dealing with them in Libya until today, because they do not want to leave. There was a call for election in 2014. These people still came back, did not want to leave the seats they established, and you can't. It's very hard to leave power.
So they didn't accept the new elections,
exactly,
and the new results
in
2014.
And they didn't. They put themselves within those results, and these the results came out in a. It's hard to explain. There was no real election outside of these people, the same group of people who put themselves in the political picture in Libya in 2012. After 2011, of course, they stayed in the same format. So the election was a facade in somewhat, even though a lot of people thought that the liberals should have won the election, but they were taken out. So they didn't accept it. They were not even given the opportunity to accept it or not. They were not given. They stayed in the same format they were in. They accepted in a way, but at the same time they managed to circumvent the authority of the liberals, even though they were higher numbers in the parliament, in the Libyan parliament. And they, after that, in 2014, they kept on going until later election, and also they did not. There was another problem, which started the split of Libya into East and West. And it was not really a split of Libya. It's more like a split between those officials. Those, between the liberals and the conservatives. So I would not call them conservatives, but because the liberals in Libya are also conservatives. If you want to look into the political science of it and the terminology, and if you want to take it back to the political dictionary. But the liberals and the religious ones, or the so-called religious ones, who took on the Muslim Brotherhood ideology as an umbrella, although they were not really Muslim Brotherhoods when it comes to ideas. And so this happened, and they created this this notion that Libya is splitting because of these individuals. One moved to the east and the other one stayed in the west, and one in Tripoli, the other one went to Benghazi or Tobruk. And right after that, there was this inception of the military insurgent in Libya that had to fight for the radicals, the ISIS in the east. And because they won the war against them, it was a bloody war for about 2-3 years. They won against them. They have to retain the victories and the glories of, and they assumed themselves, and they assumed the powers, and they consolidated all the powers in the east and in that part of the world. And Libyans in that part of the world actually welcomed them because they've lived under those radical entities for a few years, and they didn't like it. Just to know over a few about Libyan society, it's very, it's not a radical one. It's not the conservative in the meaning of the conservative society like the one you see in the Middle East. It's a very open society. Like Libya, for example, Tripoli, for example, it has 5 churches in there, even though it's 100% Muslims. Those 5 churches are actually for visitors and workers. And those maintained by taxpayers. So they're not actually maintained by outside money or the Vatican or anything. It's like the Libyans that actually pay for them. So it just gives you an idea of how Libyans actually see them, treat religion, or how the Libyan society is. Right after that, it seems like the United Nations throughout since 2011. I mean, this is the situation until today. That's what happened until. This situation continued to be the case until about a year ago. Throughout this time, since 2011 until now, United Nations has continued to be to have a more of an impact on the Libyan dealings and wheelings. So they, instead of being monitoring and supporting the way of building democratic institutions in Libya, they became part of the trading of positions, and they and the UN went outside of its mandate that was established into creating a new entity in last year. This entity, it's called the Group of 75, and this was the idea by the last the last envoy to Libya, Salama, and his employee, Stephanie Williams. And they brought 75 people they know very well. Those 75 people seem to have, to them at least, they come from different factions in Libya. And they put them together in one room and they say, create a government now. Mm-hmm. So basically, this is what they did. I mean, in my view, this is illegal to begin with, because it's illegal because of the UN has no mandate of creating government in Libya, because this belongs to Libyans. Second, in my view also, that the UN did not really encourage elections in Libya in a serious way. And the rhetoric was always there. You know, we want elections, we want democratic society, but it's in reality, that was not the case. So as a result, they created the government. The government, because these 75 people, they're people, they come from different factions, and they were easily corrupt. Mm-hmm. And because they were not chosen by people. So, I mean, the person who chose them is somebody from the UN. The head of the UN mission is not even the UN leadership.
But they assumed these people would have some authority, they would represent different fractions of the Libyan society.
And more so, they assume, or I don't know if they assumed, maybe they knew that this was going to happen. But I mean, the logic behind bringing people that they come to your office all the time and you know them, that they will create a government, that it's a unifying government. It's actually absurd, because there's no such thing of having a unifying government. The idea of having a unifying government from 75 people only. Somebody will always disagree with that. The only way is to go to election. This is why we have, representative democracy. That's why representative democracy has been a practical way of doing things in the last, hundreds of years. We don't put 75 people in a place. And if we want to go to Plato's way of doing things, which is bring us the intellectuals and put them in a room, those were not the intellectuals. Those were not the intellectuals or the wise men who can just sit in one room and dictate the government. So it was really a failed attempt from the beginning, and I made sure that the UN heard that. I disagreed with that completely, and you and I talked about this a lot before. So now we have this government in Libya, the de facto government, is supposed to be a unifying government, is not doing a very great job. This government is supposed to prepare the country for election in December 2021. Until today, this government has not took one step towards that. It's actually doing other things. And the president of the prime minister, the prime minister who's supposed to be just an interim prime minister, because this government is supposed to be an interim government until we have a real election in Libya. This government now is actually running a campaign on the expense of the Libyan money. Basically, they're running a campaign while they're in the government, and they're going to run for the presidency, the prime minister. So the situation has gone from a corrupt to a more corrupt, has gone from bad to worse. So the UN involvement in Libya has made things worse. The whole thing, what happened in 2011, changing the government of Libya and establishing an idea of regime change was completely insulting to the Libyan people. Yes, the Libyan people revolted against the government, but also did not want to change it. Nobody consulted the Libyans. And you probably heard this from Macron just last week. He just announced that we disrespected the Libyan people. So finally the French apologized in a different way when they were talking with Africans about Mali. So this is the idea of what's happening in Libya. We're supposed to have an election in December, but it looks that it's like it's going to be
dubious whether this will really take place.
And the one thing, and it's hard to imagine that we're going to have a transparent election, basically, because money has got involved so much in the process. So, but we'll see. I hope that things will work out. But so this is sorry for that.
Okay, no, it was necessary probably to go back a bit more. But currently the country is divided territorially. So there are two governments. So At least this is what you get from the media if you read the current situation.
It's not really two governments now. There's only one government. This is unifying government now. It's in Tripoli. But there is a faction that acts in the east, run by General Haftar. He's the de facto government in the east. I wouldn't call Libya a split now. It's not. It's not split.
People can move freely between
of course,
two areas.
Oh yeah, it's you can move from any part of Libya now, but it's is it safe or not? This is another issue. But there's no problem moving in Libya, and it's getting better that way. And it's never been a problem of movement. I mean, until I think there was a problem of movement in 2011, 2012. But after that, I think the movement was not a problem at all. Of course, the airports were destroyed and closed and everything, so this is but people can just drive. The problem is to the outside world is that Libya is now divided into countries because there's two entities. It used to be another government in the east, run by somebody called Tini, and he's of course allegiance to General Haftar, who's ruling with the power of military and morally because he won against the radicals in Benghazi, and the entities, Ansar Sharia and Al-Qaeda, ISIS, all these entities, they were kicked out of Benghazi. Of course, Benghazi paid hefty price for that, but after that, so because of that, he's still considered to be. But yeah, to Libyans, Libya is still not divided yet, but it might. This might happen, although. To many, including myself, I think Libya will not be divided. Not just because Libyans want that, because I think the international community does not want to deal with two countries in this part of the world. For many reasons, economically, to the oil companies. Don't forget, when you go back in history, Libya used to be at one point semi-divided. Basically, it had a federal system. But the West and American companies did not want to have to deal with three entities. So they actually were part of unifying Libya under the king who was ousted by Gaddafi, King Idris. Idris Sanusi. Yeah.
Okay. What's the situation for an ordinary everyday life? So facilities, electricity, running water, shopping. Petrol. So has regular life resumed? So how do people cope with that? Does it affect people's everyday life, the current political situation? Or
the current one is at least Libyans now have electricity for about 3 hours a day or 4 hours a day. Some places better than that, 8 hours and 12 hours, and some places actually run for even 24 hours. But for the last 10 years, last year, electricity could be out for a few days, completely. This is during the summer, for example, when it's 40, 45, 50 degrees outside. So imagine how life is, and imagine fridges you cannot have food in there. So Libyans have gone through a painful experience. Fighting between factions. The militia is the law in Tripoli, for example, in Benghazi. The government and the de facto government in the West are the militias, the religious and otherwise, the pragmatic one. And many people think of them as regional militias, but I don't think so. I think they are just very pragmatic, and they make alliances with them, with the others, and they're just out for the money, basically.
And how can we imagine this? So this is quarters of cities that are controlled by gang-like militias.
This is basically what it is. They actually insert themselves into the political spectrum of things as well. They actually help people too. They become it's literally a laughable way of governing. It's medieval in one.
So this is protection records, but they're connected to the political field. And they support single individuals.
Right. And they're very simple, basically. They just want money. So the political entities that behind them is the problem. The people who are actually have money or know how to get money. They know how, but how to facilitate money in the country are the ones who supporting these militias, and these militias are for hire. They're basically gun for hire. So that's how they work. Also, let's not forget militias in or what's happening in the East as well. They operate as an entity that is supposedly the military, the Libyan military, but actually operate as militias as well. So they're both militias.
So in the region that Haftar controls, these are partly soldiers from the former armed forces of Libya, state forces, but at the same time, these connect with local youngsters who would join, and then they control areas, and the distinction between who is now a uniform and a regular soldier and who is not is no longer possible to be drawn.
It's pretty much like that, and it's not just those. Also, the religious entities that are supporting General Haftar, for example, are actually in disagreement with the religious entities that are in the West. So they're partly soldiers, ex-soldiers, soldiers who were part of the military before, and people who are became part of his entourage because of what happened in Benghazi. What happened in Benghazi is was very painful in people of Benghazi, because those religious entities and the ISIS and the Ansar Sharia and all these people have made it very difficult for Libyans. And they were basically, they brought in the ideas from Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia and all these countries, the Wahhabism and so many foreign things. I talked about socialism being foreign. Also, radical Islam is very foreign to Libyans. Libyans lived what we called it the Sanusi Islam. It's a very open-minded Islam. It's very lenient. It's pretty much as the Islam of North Africa, with Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. That doesn't mean that it's different somewhere else, but this is how it is in Libya. So when these guys brought in all these ideas, Libyans did not really connect with it or saw themselves in them. So also these people were very violent as well. So in their they were the treatment of women in the streets. Libyan women walk in the streets freely. Of course they wear the hijab and everything, but this is the hijab is a sign of empowerment, not the opposite. So they did not really. So those people who really went through this painful experience also joined forces with the militias of Haftar, and they took on the call of really free Libya from all this stuff. So there are a lot of noble ideas amongst all these activities, but they are misguided noble ideas or misguided noble approaches. So.
Libya is a typical case for current wars, to the extent that we see a mixture of domestic and external actors. So it's not just something that can be reduced to inner Libyan affairs, but as you said, right from the start, so from the crisis of the regime in 2011, the first protests, and then the engagement of NATO countries, the entire affair is very internationalized. Not only the UN, but there are also other external actors involved here. So what would you say? Who are these? Why are they there? Why are they engaged? There are many. We perhaps cannot run through all of them, but perhaps you would highlight a few and tell us what you think, why they engage themselves in this conflict.
Well, just before I get to that, I'll just give you an idea of how this happened. In 2011, on February 15th, the people revolted in the east of Libya, in Benghazi, to be exact, and in some other cities, but in Benghazi started. Benghazi never really was fond of Gaddafi's government. because of tribal allegiance and many other issues. So it's a place of dissent for many decades. But the revolt was basically, it's almost, if you wanna bring like analogy here, it's actually less than the yellow vests in Paris or in France, in terms of the violent, or in terms of how violent they were. So there were like a small number of people, but the government did not know how to approach it. So because they're not used to having this kind of revolt in the country, so even the security agencies and the security institutions did not know how to deal with this. So this is foreign to them. So at that point, this is the moment that many of Gaddafi's enemies, and Gaddafi had many enemies. Gaddafi did not rule with the wise, as a wise government. Gaddafi had ideological ideas, either the Arab pan-Arab, or the pan-Africa, or the anti-West, or the against radicalism, or against some countries, or helping the revolutions around the world. There's so many things Gaddafi was involved in. The IRA, the West never really forgave Gaddafi for those, even though they made peace, but it was really a short peace that, it was
the
not
last
really
years of his rule, compromises,
and
the refugee deal, and these questions.
Exactly, and there were unholy deals, and they clearly there was discomfort, and Gaddafi felt comfortable. That's why he really relaxed his guards, and this is one of his problems. Before that, there was no problem in Libya for him or his government. So. What happened was alliance, like I mentioned. I use that term quite a bit because it's really unholy alliances between Western democracies, France, England, and United States. Basically, those are the main actors in the involvement in Libya. And it's mainly France and England, basically. It's basically Cameron in England, and Sarkozy in Libya, in France, and these are the leaders behind all that. And they commit crimes. They engaged in Libya even before the international community decided to engage in Libya. So what happened is, because of this little revolt, that there was. The West saw this as an opportunity to really take care of Gaddafi finally, because for finally there is a resistance, that it's open resistance in Libya. Finally, there is people like going in the street in Libya and saying no to Gaddafi, and therefore we could take this opportunity and get rid of him, because he has been a nuisance for them. Nuisance for many, nuisance for the American involvement in Africa, the French involvement in Africa, and. A lot about that, about this situation, and he hasn't been like just a problem for. Even when they made peace with him, he continued to be a problem. Even when they approach him with these contracts, he continued to be an issue for them. So they saw this. There is no way of dealing with Libya or dealing with Africa without removing this hurdle, which is stop many. The corporate France and corporate England had a say in this. With the internal actors being the Libyans, who really wanted to have a better life but did not want to dislodge the government, and the religious entity who really wanted to do away with the whole government completely, because they saw it as an enemy to their being, to their who they are, to their core. And with those countries who felt that for Sarkozy, for example, he was the Total company had issues with Libya because Gaddafi has refused their involvement in Libya, and this is billions of dollars that has to do with gas, the new discovery of gas in Libya, and this is very important. Also, the British government, who had a huge history with Libya, long bloody history with Libya, and they never really forgave him for that. So all these came together and decided that an end has to happen, and it's and it's sad because really the Libyans were the last to know, and the last to really say anything about this, and they were watching this as if it's a movie, basically. Yeah.
So that was the first round of how external actors came in, very suddenly, so to say, but with a huge impact, because it triggered the war.
Absolutely.
And the intervention was actually without a plan, apart from the fact that Gaddafi should go. But what and how and who should replace him, what kind of structure would then...
was not a problem for the West, and this is why we see this today. You look at Libya today and you see that what happened. I mean, we have really like a small like the UN itself, involvement in Libya is very minimal. The approach to Libya, it's almost like it doesn't exist. I mean, this is, if you take this economically, you have to understand Libya, yes, it's a rich oil country, but it's really 60% of exporters are Italy and Spain. So the Libyan oil goes to those two countries, mostly. So the Libyan oil does not really impact the United States. The United States will approach Libya only through corporate, but it's oil, it's not important to them like it's Saudi Arabia or other countries. So really the oil and the economic situation and the oil in Libya really is related to those Mediterranean countries.
It's not of global.
It's not of global impact.
On global markets for oil and oil products.
The percentage is meaningless when it comes to the market. The Libyan share of the market, it's really you cannot really even think of it. So this is not based on that specifically, but also there's corporation behind that too, who really have a big interest in Libya. So it's not as much as the oil, as much as the business opportunities in Libya that are very important to those. But just if I take you back to the core of these problems, and I don't think it's economic. I think it's more. I think it's more of an issue with Gaddafi and future programs in Libya, and they never thought of this because they cannot be this naive to think that the Muslim Brotherhood maybe rule Libya. The Muslim Brotherhood never ruled anywhere. They had a failed experience in Egypt, and it didn't end up well. And we see them throughout. They're not really good at governance. So, but were they thinking that the liberals will lead Libya? I mean, they probably thought of having some of their own people, henchmen in Libya who have a friendly government. Doesn't matter if it's
some simple structure would emerge
right.
That could be handled or
can be handled on that way.
Be a government of Libya, so to say, but not a country or a leader with its own will standing in their way.
Exactly.
And then the old worries about the conflicts France had in Chad,
or Niger, or Mali, and it's just it's basically this is how simple it is, but it didn't happen that way. I mean, they wished for this scenario to happen,
Okay, and now we have another corollary of actors, so Qatar, Egypt, Russia. Perhaps these three, very briefly, could we say why are they engaged?
So it's the way it is now. It's actually Qatar is supporting the Muslim Brotherhoods. Qatar and Turkey are both alliance supporting the Muslim Brotherhood government in Tripoli. And even when the Muslim Brotherhood became a marginal entity, they became marginal entity in Tripoli, they continue to support whatever entity is in Tripoli or the West. The French and Russia, Italy of course plays both parties. French and Russia and the UAE supported General Haftar in the east. So Egypt, of course, will continue to support Haftar in the east because of geographical reasons, because they're closer to him.
It's not always the same motivation, but for Egypt it's more to have a stabilized boundary zone.
The border, yeah.
That there is a buffer zone between whatever's going on in Libya and the domestic
exactly.
politics.
And also Egypt is always known to many Libyans that Egypt has some ambitions in Libya. I mean, there's also border disputes, an area called Jarbu. It's an old one. I think the Egyptians have this idea of this should be part of Egypt, but this is not really an issue. It's more of like having a stable western border to and the government in Egypt is a security-based government, so they think of this is how they think, and also it's a business opportunity to have a good alliance with whoever is ruling this part of the world near them. So Libya is a big country with small population, and it can take a lot of more workforce that Egypt need to export. So Libya is a business opportunity and security opportunity for Egypt. So that's why it's getting involved. And the other side, of course, you got Algeria, and because of the geographical proximity to Libya, with Tunisia, before what happened in Tunisia in the last few months, they were supporting the Muslim Brotherhood's government in Tripoli. So all these entities operate within very shallow pragmatism. It's the opposite. These entities, in their own way, they seem to push for splitting Libya, but the idea of the Western look into what's happening in Libya and what they want from Libya, they want it to be one entity. Well, this is also who says that? I think it's Bill Clinton who used to say all politics are local, and I think that happens with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and support of United States support of one against the other because it's local. Basically, the elections in the United States. And this is also applies to what's happened in the Middle East and the Gulf countries. The conflict between Qatar and UAE and with Saudi Arabia, this family of small nations, those minuscule states have their own conflict, and they export that they try to, once they saw the money and they saw that they can really impact the North African countries and some parts of the Middle East, like with Syria, for example, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. They saw that the wealth can really have, and so they sought this power. They sought this added value, basically. So one of them is in Libya. So Qatar supported the Muslim Brotherhood. The UAE supported, for example, Libya General Haftar. And Saudi Arabia was between those, although it always had a standing opposition to Muslim Brotherhood as well. But those countries have alliance with so Qatar and built an alliance with France, and both of them supported the East, General Haftar, and this has relation to Total, the company Total, which is and it's
former state-owned French company, but
has some Qatar
connection. Aquitaine, the formerly French state-owned big oil company,
and they have a connection to Qatar, and those and this is a. This company had a project in Libya that it's joint between France and Qatar. So when there's the mafia expression, follow the money. When you follow the money, you understand how things are. And you see Italy on the other side is supporting the United States and softly. Like I mentioned before, United States is sitting in the background. Like what happened in 2011, for example, Obama was really pulled to this war. He did not want to intervene in Libya. He was he was pressured by Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton thought victory in Libya and taking out Gaddafi could be a good for her re-election as a president of the United States. Misguided as well, and did not understand the Libyan society and just was reading those false reports from some of anti-Gaddafi people in the United States.
Now, this oil argument, we have talked about this to explain foreign actors' involvement has its limits. So it's certainly there, but it doesn't explain everybody's engagement. Right. In political science, very often we have this argument about the rentier state, so countries that possess these large quantities of mineral resources are basically prone to become, authoritarian or end up in civil wars and severe internal conflicts because local elites or the political class would compete about the appropriation of these rents. Right. And would you say that explains the current difficulty of the political dynamic in Libya as well, or is that too easy?
No, it's as a picture. I think this is actually one of the core problems of Libya locally, though. It has nothing to do with the conflict that's happening. I think the way the social and the economic dynamic of Libya is built on the rent economy, and it's creating a problem for Libya. The minute Libya discovered oil, it felt like it should really make its people happy and just throw money at them. And this is philosophically and in the political science is a problem because it does away with the idea of citizenship, because citizens pay taxes. Rent states do not pay taxes, usually, and if they do, it's meaningless. So the idea that building citizenship is true through paying taxes, and through paying taxes, citizens feel that they can really change the government because this is their government, these are their taxes, and there is the term we hear a lot, especially in North American politics, is taxpayers, and the taxpayers can change the government, can change things, but people who get handouts do not change governments. And people who get handouts always create whether they mean or they don't mean to do so, is they create some sort of totems, and these they become really like I call it totems. They stay forever because the handouts are part of their economic dynamics. So those states continue to be non-functional states. They become non-productive states, far away from being a knowledge society. The ideas of, for example, freedom and liberty and women's rights, these are meaningless because really the opportunities are handouts. Basically, there is no call for it. So basically, this is actually the core issue of how Libyan society operates, and that's why Libya will continue to have difficulty moving towards either a knowledge society or a modern society, because this is a very part of the Libyan psyche. Libyans, when they talk about oil, they say, "This is our oil. It's not the oil of the state." This is an issue. How can you convince the Libyans that this is not your oil? This is the oil that goes to the states, and then the states make sure that you have good education, good healthcare, a good place to live, opportunity to work, not the work. Because Libyans throughout, for the last 50, 60 years, they have been getting, they don't basically pay nothing for taxes, this one thing, pay nothing for water or electricity. All this is subsidized. Everything in Libya is subsidized, from education to food, to bread, to little things. So, it's the liter of benzene in Libya, the gases cost 8 cents. What do you expect? This is, and it creates other economies that is building corruption, like
other expectations, so to say.
Right. So this is the way if I can summarize that. And I'm not saying that it's not going to, Libyans will never move away from that, but I think the difficulty is to move from a psyche like this to one that is productive. It comes with hefty price, and I'm not sure Libyans are capable of really going through this, because all the symptoms, not symptoms, but all the what we see today from the way Libyans act, it contradicts this notion of moving towards something that it's.
And you would need to pay the price before you get something in return.
Right.
Right. So you would renounce or do without the handouts.
Right.
And you have to wait until a state would deliver that public service that is paid by taxes. And this is the thing, like, this is maybe easier than under dictatorship, but it's a good dictatorship that understands the benefits. Democracies that come every 4 years, that need to be elected and need to pander to the public and tell them what they want, and it's difficult at this point, especially when it's not part of who they are. So if I go tomorrow, for example, if I put myself in the election and I go, and I will say to Libyans, you really need to give up all this. We need to cut public subsidies to half of yours, and we need to make sure that Libyans start paying for things and not subsidize. The opposition to that, even though this is what's good for them, the opposition to that will be huge, will be enormous. And the people who are like for example, like, why is this interim government now it's winning and it's getting the Libyans to like them? I mean, they're running their campaign with Libyan money, but Libyans still okay with it because they're adding to they're actually intensifying the psyche of handouts, this idea of people staying at home and do nothing. They just increased in the last couple of months. Passive attitude towards politics.
Right. It's very it's very harmful, and it goes up to treason, in my view. But the Libyans, after going through all this, after going through horrific experience in the last 10 years, thanks to Britain and France and the international community in general, are actually in no mood of austerity or in no mood of changing the way. So there is something to it as well, they actually look for some happiness, and this is one of the problems. In sociology, when nations really start to, including from moving from a collective national memory to a collective attitude towards
building something, but after a period in which you think you have suffered from a process and a war and a situation that you have not caused by yourself, you're expecting rewards or compensation. Okay, so to end our conversation, let's talk briefly of how you relate to this. So you're now with us in Bremen. Luckily, it's great for us. So you're following these affairs. How do you involve, or how do you interact with the dynamic in Libya?
Well, I'm an academic, of course, and I've, in the last few years I was in Columbia University, and now I'm with you at Bremen, and it's a very good opportunity for me, and I'm happy that I'm here. I'm actually I was not allowed to continue my job of teaching in Tripoli. So this is good for me that I have an opportunity elsewhere. But I am also very involved in politics. So I have been since 2012 I have been involved with mediations. We had the first meeting of mediations between different factions in Libya. We did that in Malta in 2013, 2015. Also, we did another meeting in Doha in Qatar, 2016, 2016 again in Istanbul, 2017 in Istanbul again. I continue to work with many of the agencies, part of the UN. Of course, I have disagreement always with how they handle things in Libya and how they approach Libya. I think I've been writing a lot about Libya and making sure that my writings are read or heard. I've been doing TV interviews. I'm involved in interviews such as this with yourself. And I'm also encouraging Libyans to really go to the election, even if the results are bad, even if we do not get anywhere. At least it's almost like going to the gym. You need to start soft, or going for a run. You need to run for 5 minutes, and then 10 minutes, and then 20, and maybe after that you can run a marathon. So, and the Libyans really have no heritage or no history of democratic cultures. So, and like many others in that part of the world, and maybe have not been given an opportunity also. But you need to help yourself. You can't always blame the West and other outside entities. You always have to take the initiative to really lift yourself up, and you have to start somewhere. So I am part of lots of activism, big activism efforts into pushing for elections. Doesn't matter what the results will be. Even if this corrupt government that will stay, I'm fine with it. As long as we have an election that will build for another election, and maybe at one point Libyans will start to think that we should move away from nepotism, electing your cousin, or moving away from understanding that Libya could be built by patriot Libyans who really understand that certain laws can be established. I mean, this will be utopic. I'm not looking forward. I'm not really saying that, but I'm saying that if we can have laws that protect women, if we can protect education, if we can have laws that protect creating opportunities instead of continuing the ideas of handouts. If we can have all that, that would be something. Sometimes you shoot for the sky and you hit the roof, and you're fine if you hit the roof. So this is what I. So yeah, I continue to be a voice, and I will always continue to be a voice when it comes to Libya. This is my home, and I think many people with bad intentions have got involved in Libya, and we need to make sure that they're not involved in Libya anymore.
Okay, thank you very much, Mabruk. We wish you luck. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for having me.
Okay.